For photographing in black and white, it gives us an opportunity to see the world in a very different way, in a way that is dominated by shape, by form, by texture, by light, by the very basic things that make up our photographs. It's ironic because when we learned photography back in the past, we would start on black and white, and it built up our way of seeing the world before we introduced colour. And let's face it, colour can be distracting sometimes. Sometimes it can be very, very overwhelming. Sometimes it's just simply not appropriate for the type of photograph that we're taking. So learning black and white will open so many more creative possibilities for you with your photography. But it's a lot more than simply changing a photograph to black and white. My name is William Eames. Welcome to lesson number 2 on the smartphone photography course. Welcome to black and white photography. So just a very quick little bit of housekeeping. You know how to log in at this stage. I hope you're still getting all your reminders for the lessons as well. You can download our app, and of course you can manage your class schedule at any stage throughout the course. If you need to go back over lessons or you want to catch up on recordings, anything like that can all be managed through your login area. So as I mentioned, we're on lesson number 2, which is all about black and white photography. And there's a lot more to black and white photography than simply changing it to black and white. So some things we're going to cover in this lesson: we're going to talk about seeing in black and white, color versus black and white, tonal separation, very important, elements of a good black and white photograph, and how to edit for black and white as well. So the first thing is to talk about seeing in black and white. What's the difference between seeing in black and white and seeing in colour? And black and white is more than just changing a colour photograph into a black and white one. Simply changing a photograph to black and white does not fix it. And this is one of my absolute pet peeves, where, a photographer will take a photograph, it's not so good in colour, so they'll turn it into black and white, thinking that this will improve the shot. Now, sometimes they'll absolutely get lucky, and turning it into black and white will improve the shot, but I guarantee you they don't understand why changing it to black and white makes the photograph better. So seeing in black and white is skill, and learning to see in black and white will actually also help you to improve your color photography as well. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's have a look at this photograph here, for example. Some photographs are made to be in color and should not be in black and white, like this one here. Very obvious example, these very colourful umbrellas. We've got a clear blue sky against them as well, but there's lots of natural contrast here because we can see all of the different colours. So the red looks very different from the blue. Very easy to distinguish them and distinguish all the different colours that we have here. What happens if we change this to black and white? Well, things get kind of complicated then when we turn things into black and white. But first of all, obviously, we change completely what this photograph is about. This photograph was about colour. It's about those colourful umbrellas. Now they're just grey. Now, what we can also see here, though, however, is that it's difficult to distinguish between all of these umbrellas now. A lot of them are very much the same shade of grey. They're the same tones. If you have a look at the kind of middle row here, if I was just to go back a slide, we can see here, in the very middle row, we've got kind of a pink purple, we have orange, we have red, yellow, and a light blue. We come back to this slide, and they look the exact same. And this is because all their tones are the same. So colour and tone are very, very different. Colour is obviously colour, where we see very different varieties of colour. However, tone is the brightness or the darkness of that colour. And this is where things can get difficult with turning a colour photograph into black and white, because what might look very contrasty to us as a colour photograph, when we turn it into black and white, suddenly becomes very flat like this. Let's have a look at some more examples. So here we've got a nice photograph here, lots of very colourful flowers, lots of nice kind of separation with the sky, deep blue sky, that green line of the trees, and then all of those wonderful colours there throughout the field. We turn this into black and white, and it becomes very hard to distinguish between all those flowers. It becomes quite flat. There's no contrast. There's no tonal separation between those flowers, except for that streak of white flowers there and the kind of dark tree line. But apart from that, if you have a look at the sky and we have a look at those flowers, they're very hard to distinguish in terms of the difference. There's no contrast, especially with those flowers. It just looks like a big grey mass of, it's just so ugly. It's just not pleasant to look at all. This is because there's no tonal separation between those flowers. Plenty of colour separation, but when we take away that colour, we see that the tones are all the same. Now, there's also times when colour doesn't work, colour can be distracting, or just unnecessary to a photograph. Like this photograph here, we've got lots of kind of blue here in the shot, and I mean, it's not really doing anything for the photograph at all. If we were to take away the colour here, it changes it because we suddenly are focusing a lot more on the shapes, we're focusing on the perspective of the photograph, we're focusing on the textures of the buildings here and everything else in the shot as well. So by removing that kind of blue colour that really dominated the photograph, we look at this photograph in a completely different way. Here's another example. Sometimes there's just nothing to be gained by having colour in the photograph here. Like we've got very strong contrasty light. We've only got a tiny little bit of colour really in this photograph as it is. We've got the skin tone, we have the lips, and we've got the kind of wood here in the background. But if I take that away, the photograph becomes stronger without it. Okay, so we focus very much on that those sharp angles, that really contrasting light here. We've got a bit of texture here in the jumper that the girl here is wearing. So the photograph becomes different. It becomes stronger, in my opinion at least, when this shot is in black and white, and just simply becomes much more visually interesting. So tones are all about the kind of brightness or the darkness of the colour. Now, when we are photographing, we've only got kind of two, I suppose, absolutes in terms of black and white. We've got pure white and we've got pure black. Everything else in between pure white and pure black is a different shade of grey, a different tone of grey. When we add colour to that, obviously then we've got kind of brighter and darker colours depending on what that tone of grey is underneath. So here, for example, this is a grayscale version of the red kind of gradient here that we have on top, and we can just see it's different shades of grey, just from light to darker shades of grey. And when we add our red over it, they become light to dark. So we're going from almost pink right to a much more deep kind of burgundy colour. Now, where this can get tricky and where it can get difficult is when some of these colours can appear very different from each other, but tonally will actually be very, very similar. So here, for example, we've got just greens here, and green is a very interesting colour because green is the colour that the eye can distinguish between the most different variations of. So, you know, a very famous kind of phrase here in Ireland, 40 shades of green. And I mean, it's true technically because we can see so many different variations of green that we can notice all of the little differences. Even in this little block here, we've just got 9 different greens, but they're all quite distinct. They're all quite different from each other. If I change this to grayscale, I change it to black and white, there's a very different story here. We can see that tonally a lot of these colours are very, very similar, particularly those ones on the right hand side, the kind of more luminous colours, the brighter colours. They actually appear almost identical. Then we've got those kind of darker shades here as well, those darker shades of green and the lighter shades of green actually, they almost appear identical as well. So particularly when it comes to green, you know, when we turn this into black and white, it can be a very problematic colour, like we saw back in some of the previous examples there. So If you're photographing, say, a forest, for example, and there's lots of green in it, you might find that when you turn that into black and white, that it's nowhere near as strong as you thought it was going to be, and that's because it lacks tonal separation. Let's do one more example of this. Here we've got much more broader spectrum of different colors. So our yellows, our oranges, our reds, our pinks, blues, all the way in through our darker colors. And again, I turn this into grayscale or black and white. And again, as you can see here, those very distinct colors are oranges, yellows, and reds. They're almost identical here in the over on the left hand side. So again, think about this. These are colors of a sunset. If you're photographing a sunset, you turn that into black and white, you're going to have this issue where all these greys just kind of amass and become kind of one big clump of grey with not much detail or separation. Then we've got our darker colors here. So we've got our really dark kind of purples, we've got dark blues, and our blacks then as well. And again, they're almost the exact same. So think about this then when you're photographing. If you photograph something in color, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make a really good black and white photograph. Now, so building upon that awareness of color versus black and white, and that those issues with tones, there are ways that we can overcome that just through the use of our different approaches to our black and white. And like our composition, there's certain guidelines that we can follow when we're photographing black and white that will really help us to achieve successful black and white photographs. And elements to successful black and white photography, basically they include light, contrast, texture, form, shape, and pattern. So we're going to have a look at all of these. So you can mix these all up in your photographs, or you could try and just concentrate on one of them and see if you can capture at least one of them within your black and white photographs. But more than likely there's going to be a bit of crossover between these different elements. Now again, these are not strict kind of guidelines or anything, but these are a really great way to help you to see in black and white, to practice and to improve your eye when it comes to black and white photography, and then that will in turn lead to better color photographs as well. So starting with light. So first of all, remember our key and fill lighting. This is going to become much more important when it comes to black and white, because you're stripping away that color. You know, you're looking at things in I don't want to say more basic way, but in a much more fundamental way, I suppose. Like in this photograph here, this is a really great shot full of really deep dark tones here, with just that little hint of key light there, just to bring out the texture on her skin. So remember your key and fill lighting. It can make for very dramatic photographs, particularly with our key lights. If you're photographing on using outdoor light, think about the direction of the sun. Think about the time that you're photographing at. How high the sun is, and so on. Like a midday sun will produce shorter shadows. So if you're not after long shadows, a midday sun will produce shorter shadows. But if you want long shadows, you're going to be thinking about photographing a little bit later on in the day or a little bit earlier on in the day. And do think about using shadows to add more contrast to the scene. Different times of day will create those different angles of light, and your lighting can be hard or soft. So what do I mean by that? Well, we'll have a look at that now in just a second. But hard light will produce very harsh shadows, very defined shadows, very deep dark tones. Soft light will produce softer shadows, and we'll still have details in those shadows as well. So here's a very classic example of a hard light photograph. So this is all the way back from 1915. So this is Fifth Avenue, I believe, 1915, from Paul Strand, one of the earlier pioneers of photography. And as we can see here, this was taken, I think it was taken early in the morning. It's kind of hard to tell whether it's early in the morning or late in the evening, but we can tell from the direction of the shadows that the sun was at an angle. And we've got very defined shadows here as well. So we can see, the shapes of the people very much here, walking behind them almost on the pavement. We've got that building there in the background, adding these kind of really dark square shapes. So there's something very almost dystopian about the shot. But a great photograph there, a good example of hard light. Soft light, as I mentioned, kind of more soft here. As we can see, we still have plenty of contrast in the photograph, but we have a nice softness to the skin. There's no real hard shadows in the photograph. It almost has a dreamlike quality to it, and it really suits a shot like this, where you want kind of a softer atmosphere to the photograph. Now, soft light can also be achieved by using reflectors, something we'll speak about in an upcoming lesson, which you can bounce light back onto people to help reduce down those shadows and give that kind of soft lighting effect. A little bit later on in the lesson as well, we'll have a look at how you can edit to achieve kind of softer contrast and soft light within your shots. And speaking of contrast is a very, very important element when it comes to black and white photography. An important element when it comes to photography in general, but something that much more visible when we're photographing in black and white. And contrast is the difference between the black and white tones in our photographs. So as I mentioned, we only have two absolutes with pure black and pure white. Everything else is grey in between. And too much grey tones is going to produce a photograph that's got low contrast. So high contrast is when we have tones that are falling at the more extreme ends, where the between to the whites and to the blacks. Like this photograph here is a perfect example. You've got the white, the milk, I presume, which is against a stark black background, which gives us a perfect contrast. High contrast will give a very punchy look to your photographs, a lot of impact to your shots, adds depth to a photograph, which is really important when it comes to black and white photography, especially when it comes to printing. So if you are printing off your photographs, contrast is very important, as you'll quickly see and tell a low contrast photograph from a high contrast photograph when you print it off. And if you really want to give yourself a good challenge, do print off your photographs in black and white, to see what might look good on a screen looks very, very different in print. So, in contrast is a key tell on that. Hard light will produce high contrast, soft light will produce low contrast. So we are speaking about the different types of lighting there, and that contrast is a byproduct of that as well. And a low contrast will give a dreamlike quality to our photograph. So you're after kind of more, say, melancholy type of shot, or a dreamlike kind of shot, or just a softer type of photograph, you want to go with low contrast. So here is an absolute masterful shot displaying contrast from a Polish photographer named Marcin Rysek. Marcin Rysek, I'll put his name in the notes so you can check him out afterwards. This isn't a photoshopped image or anything like that. This is a photograph that was taken on a bridge overlooking the river here, and as we can see, it's just a gentleman feeding swans. We've got so much contrast going on in this photograph. We've got the contrast of him against the snow. You can even see all the footprints and the texture in the snow. We've got the contrast and the white swans against the kind of grey waters here, and that perfect line separating them, almost like a yin and yang. So very famous photograph, a recent one here from 2013. It's just absolute masterful trifecta of contrast in the shot. So high contrast. Here we've got an example of high contrast. As you can see, the white tones are nearly completely blown out altogether. We've almost got a graphic kind of quality to the shot. It's almost like a stamp or a stencil. The dark tones are very, very dark. It gives a really impactful type of shot. But then we've got low contrast here as well. As we can see, everything is grey. So if you look closely at this photograph, there's no real darks. There's a little bit of white in the photograph in the hair, but in general, everything is nice and soft and grey. With that shallow depth of field, it really works well to give that dream-like quality, that dream-like effect or aura, I should say, to the photograph. So next we have texture, and one of the great things about black and white photography is that it can make the most ordinary seem that little bit more extraordinary. So something as simple as a fence, wood, or anything like that with a little bit of texture in it can become a very visually interesting photograph. For me, I mean, I suppose the way to define it, a good shot of texture will almost make the viewer feel it. They can almost feel what that texture is like in their own hands. So that's what a really good shot of texture should be like. Texture is great because it can catch light for really interesting compositions. So again, thinking about the angle of light and that, whether the sun is high or low, how the texture is catching that light can make a really interesting photograph. Natural textures will have a rustic or an earthy quality to them. Multiple textures can be used in a photograph as well. You can play around with different textures, and think about it when you're photographing food. So if you're photographing food, say in black and white, because you're losing color, which is one of the most important parts of when it comes to photographing food, you can then think about it in a different way and focus on the texture of the food, which is also very, very important. So here's an example here, good use of texture going on in the shot. We've got a few different textures here, but the main texture is clearly that wood on that boardwalk. We've kind of got the natural pattern here of that wood, that texture in the woods. And we've got a nice combination here then as well with our leading lines, of course, into the horizon. We've got a bit of a balance there with the texture of the water here as well. So this is an example where you've got kind of a lot of textures going on in the photograph, but it's all kind of brought into one shot, which is a landscape photograph. But texture shots can be also just focusing on very much on a small part of a subject. Like again here, we've got the texture of this feather. So again, you can almost feel what that feather would be like between your fingers. Just a soft, shallow depth of field shot of a small little bit of detail here on the feathers, which is that texture. So texture, it doesn't have to be complicated, it doesn't have to be overthought, it can just be something as simple as light falling onto a piece of wood that can make a really visually interesting photograph. Moving on from that, we've got our patterns and repetition, and we actually have loads of texture here in this photograph as well with that brickwork, but really it's all about the patterns and repetition, something that we had a look at in our composition lessons, but it's very effective in black and white. It's great for cities and for architectural photography. It can be really abstract as well, and it's also great to practice if light is poor. So if it's a cloudy, overcast day, you're not really getting much light or any much in the way of contrast, you can definitely try out just simple patterns and repetition. So pattern like this on architecture, on buildings, a really kind of distinct bit of architecture here. And we can see, we've got an interesting shape going on here as well. It's all about that pattern and how it's catching the light. So you can see there's quite a crossover with elements here as well, because you could say this is also about the texture of it too. So quite a lot going on in this photograph, even though it may not appear like that at first glance. And here we've got a more kind of repetition, an example of repetition. Here we're introducing our light here again, our hard light in contrast in this case, with that repetition of the pillars leading us all the way down in the photograph. So great examples here, and as you can see, these are shots that in color would probably not be anywhere near as interesting. We probably wouldn't give them a passing glance. But when they're in black and white, we concentrate on different things. We concentrate on that texture, the pattern, the light, the repetition within the shots. So finally then, when it comes to black and white photography, probably the most difficult one to capture, but would definitely be the most artistic one, is form. So form, and what do I mean by form? Well, form is a definition of it is the configuration of an object or subject. It's basically how the object or subject is made up of. It's an appreciation of the form of an object. So you think about, say, in ice skating, they talk about a skater's form. It's how delicate they are, how balanced they are, how everything that they do kind of just works and seems natural. That's form. So it's a hard one to describe, but it's basically how unique and beautiful a subject or an object is. Capturing form is a showing, it's an appreciation of the form or of a subject or an object, and it can be the most everyday objects to the most extraordinary objects as well. And I'll show you some examples of what I mean by that now in just a moment. But form is simply an appreciation of a thing or a person or part of a person or a part of something, and how you appreciate its being, of how it just simply looks. It's aesthetic. So for example, here is a very, very famous photograph from Edward Weston going back to the 1930s. At the time, or of some time, it was the most expensive photograph ever sold, and it's a photograph of a bell pepper. So as we can see here, a really unusual shape, and a really unusual kind of texture to it as well. It looks almost muscular. It looks like someone flexing their muscles. But this is an appreciation on form. This is a study on form, and it's a really great example of that. Just the shape, the contours, the way the light is caught on this bell pepper. It's just an appreciation of it as it is. And Edward Weston is a great photographer to check out if you want to kind of see more images that are about form. It was an area that he really excelled in. He photographed people as well. Photographed like he would cut open, vegetables, and he'd photograph the inside of vegetables, and they're just really magnificent photographs to look at. And another photographer, Karl Blossfeldt, and form. Flowers is a great example of form. Just photographing flowers. You have to be careful when photographing flowers in black and white, though, because color is obviously a huge part when it comes to flowers. But this is a German photographer, Karl Blossfeldt, was actually, well, amongst other things, was a botanist, and he had an appreciation for flowers. He was also a sculptor as well, so he'd be very much into form. And he just photographed all these different types of varieties of plants, just with an appreciation of them, just photographed against very simple backgrounds, very simple compositions here, just with an appreciation on their form. Now, so for the last part of this lesson, let's have a look at how to edit for black and white. So I'm going to do this through Snapseed as per usual, but of course you can use whatever app you prefer, as the methods I'm going to show are pretty much applicable right across the board. So here's a photograph that I've already opened within Snapseed. Okay, so we've got our standard options available to us are presets. Now this is one that was a JPEG, just for the sake of convenience. I just have a JPEG here, so it doesn't go straight into the develop options as though I were using a raw file. So you can go through your different options here. There are some really good black and white options as it is. Before we do that, let's have a look at the photograph. Is going to make a good black and white photograph? Well, let's see here. So there is a bit of colour here in the shot. We've got a bit of red here, particularly over on the right hand side, which I find to be very distracting. It's taking away from the subject, which is clearly this gentleman walking down this alleyway in right in the middle of where the light is being cut. Then we have that light at the end there as well, and a bit of a contrast going on with that light on the wall compared to the light on the pavement. So I can see that there's really, really strong lighting here, and I do think that would look really, really good in black and white. We want to remove that colour there as well, as it is a distraction. So yes, definitely this photograph is going to work well in black and white. So we can go through and we could try some of the options here available to us, and they are pretty good. I have to say the fine art one in particular is one of my favorites, and as I can see, just changing it to black and white there straight away, it does look good. We've got push was when we would push fill. So when we would shoot it at an ISO, say for example we had 400 ISO, but we pushed it to 800 ISO. Basically, we told the camera we were shooting on 800 ISO, so that we could then get a certain look to the shot afterwards. So that's what pushing is. We also then have structure and silhouette, as you can see. Bit too strong there. We don't want any of those options though, because we're going to do it all ourselves. So we go to tools, we go to our tune image, and we're going to reduce the saturation down. So we go to saturation first of all, and we just reduce it down altogether. The very first thing that we do. Then we can start looking at brightness. So we need to increase the brightness. I don't think so much in this. Now, this is a good example of if I just reduce it down altogether, you can see how reducing the brightness down takes away contrast in the shot. It brings back some details in the lighter parts of the image, so that's something that might work, but really it reduces contrast. So rather than changing the brightness, if I want to bring highlights, or if I want to bring some detail back, I can go to my highlights option instead, and I can reduce that down. And that will help to bring back a little bit of detail in those highlights. Now it will flatten the light out a little bit. That's okay, because we're going to add some contrast to the photograph in a moment. Similarly then, with the shadows, we could also increase the shadows if we wanted to bring some more details back there, but I don't think so. Now we could also reduce the shadows down here. As you can see, it begins to really add a bit of a punch to the shot, but I'll reduce the shadows down a little bit, not too much, because I don't want to lose too much detail, because now I'm going to add some contrast. So come up to our contrast. If we increase the contrast, you can see if I push it to its max, those white parts of the photograph, the light parts, are very, very light, and the dark parts are very dark. Now it could go the other way, and as you can see, when I flatten it out altogether, it just loses its impact altogether. Doesn't suit this particular type of photograph, but that's not to say that low contrast can't work. So I'm going to increase it a little bit. We'll go to roughly about 20, and I'll just do a quick before and after to see how I'm going. Okay, I might actually increase that contrast a little bit more. I'm just bang it up a little bit there, and yeah, now we've got a really nice punchy shot. So I'm happy with those edits for now. Those are my basic edits. So if I click OK on that, that's saved for me now. Now I want to go into some of my other options. I can go to details. If I want to add a bit of structure to it, as I mentioned before, structure is mid-tone contrast. Okay, so we can reduce it down. It adds kind of a softening type of look to the shot, but I'm going to increase it a little bit. It does give a nice punch to the overall shot. Okay, so it's subtle enough, but it brings back a little bit of that detail there in the photograph and gives me that nice punch in the image. Okay, we can also sharpen. Remember, if you want to sharpen, you want to zoom in. Okay, so we'll add a little bit of sharpening here. Not too much. So as you can see, when it gets too much, it gets a bit too, almost, for want of a better word, kind of crunchy. But I'll go to about 25. I think that should be enough. It's just subtle enough. Yeah, just it's good enough there. Okay, so just zoom back out. So overall, I'm really beginning to like how this photograph is looking. Now, moving away from that, then, if you're happy with all of those, you can hit OK, and you can check out things like your curves. If you wanted to add a kind of a flat kind of look, a faded look, you can do that. I don't want to do that in this shot because it's going to take away some of that contrast. But by increasing the dark tones, so remember we're using a histogram here, so from left to right, we've got dark to light. So if I increase the curve here on this part of the histogram, that's lightening up those dark tones, which gives me that faded type of look to the shot. Okay, and you can also do that. Then you can increase it here a little bit if you want to increase those whites. It's a nice look, and it gives it that kind of faded film look, but it's not 100% necessary here in this shot. I'll increase it ever so slightly, and I'll just hit OK on that. Okay, So you can continue away with those edits as normal. Now you are a little bit more limited when it comes to a black and white editing on Snapseed than some of the ones we're going to have a look at later, like when we talk about Lightroom a little bit later on. There's a little bit more we can do in terms of tonal separation, but the key thing really is to look to your contrast, when you're doing your editing. Now we can add some effects to it as well. You could go with a grainy type of film effect if you wanted to it. They've loads of different types of options here, but I don't want to do that for now. What I do want to do is maybe have a look at cropping the photograph. Do I need to crop the shot? I don't think it's 100% necessary. I might just reduce a little bit off the top there. No, I don't think so. So I'm going to leave that shot the way it is, but I might just add a little bit of a vignette. Now, as you can see, there are black and white filters here as it is, so you could always check those ones out. First of all, like we've got contrast, bright, dark. You can go kind of film effect, dark and sky, etc. So there is ones there available to you already. So just to go through that, you can go to tools. We've got black and white, but we're going to choose a vignette. And a vignette, as you can see, it add kind of a dark or a white kind of edge to the shot. You can move it around and you can make it larger or smaller by clicking on the icon and dragging it. So I'm just dragging it down with my fingers, so you can choose where that vignette, how strong it's going to be. But typically we'll put it in the middle, and I might just bring it out to the edges a little bit more. It's tricky at the best of times because you have to press the middle. Try that again, and then you drag it out. Okay, so if I reduce the brightness down, so it's subtle enough there, it's just adding a bit of darkness to the edges. I'll just switch it on and off so you can see. Might even just do it a little bit more. Oh, there we go. And there you can see. So it's just added a little bit more of a kind of an impact, like focusing our attention to the center. So I think that's all I would do with this shot. I'm happy with that. I just simply hit export, and then you can export, save, and so on. So that's our black and white editing. You could add a frame around the edge of it if you wanted to continue on with that kind of film type of look here. That's pretty cool. I'll just hit OK on that. Yeah, so you can continue away on that, and I really like that. I'll save another copy of that there again. So black and white editing through Snapseed. Now, so we'll finish out the lesson there. So coming up in our next lesson, we're going to be talking all about wildlife photography and macro photography. Really exciting lesson, a really popular area, and a lot of fun as well. A more challenging area for photographers, especially when it comes to macro. But we'll talk about how you can photograph your pets, how you can photograph various types of animals, and also how you can do really stunning macro photography as well. So do join me for that lesson. So as usual, well done on completing lesson number 2 on module number 2. Do hope that you enjoyed it. Any recommendations, any feedback you want to share, please email us at support@shawacademy.com. Your challenge for this lesson, you probably could have guessed it at the very start, is to simply take a black and white photograph. So take a black and white photo, use some of the things that we spoke about in this lesson. Think about form, think about patterns, repetition, texture. Think about the light in your photograph and try to mix everything up as well. And as usual, use the hashtag ShawSmartPhoto. And thank you so much for using that hashtag. So many pictures coming through now. It's great to see as it grows and grows, and we're making a community of photographers through the smartphone photography course. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me for this lesson once again. We've got another one down, so I'll see you all back very, very soon for lesson number 3 on module 2. Thank you very much, and bye bye.